Welcome back to another gentle journey through the corridors of human thought, where we explore the great minds that have shaped our understanding of the world, one quiet reflection at a time. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of ancient Athens, into the mind of perhaps the most systematic and comprehensive thinker who ever lived, a man whose ideas have echoed through over 2 millennia, shaping everything from science to ethics, from politics to poetry. Tonight we meet Aristotle, not the intimidating figure from dusty textbooks, but the curious observer of life who believed that wonder was the beginning of all wisdom. A teacher who walked the covered pathways of his school, thinking aloud with his students about everything from the flight of birds to the nature of friendship. A philosopher who looked at the world not as something to escape from, but as something endlessly fascinating to understand. As always, this isn't a lecture you need to memorize or a test you need to pass. Just let these ideas wash over you like a gentle current. Let Aristotle's voice, filtered through the centuries, speak to that part of you that's always wondered about the deeper patterns beneath everyday life. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply seeking a moment of contemplation, there's no pressure to retain every detail. Sometimes the most profound learning happens when we're not trying so hard. Before we begin our exploration, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what drew you to Aristotle tonight. Are you curled up in a cozy corner in Copenhagen at midnight? Or perhaps taking a quiet break from the day in Denver, while the afternoon sun filters through your window? The beauty of philosophy is that it transcends time and place, connecting curious minds across centuries and continents. Now, settle in comfortably. Close your eyes if you'd like, or let your gaze rest softly on something peaceful nearby. We're about to embark on a journey not just through ideas, but through a way of seeing the world that has influenced virtually every field of human knowledge. And remember, this content is designed for relaxation and reflection, not as a substitute for formal education or professional guidance. So who was this man whose thoughts still shape our world today? Picture Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era. The golden age of Greek civilization is beginning to fade, but the city still pulses with intellectual energy. In the gardens and covered walkways of the Lyceum, a school Aristotle founded, students gather not in rigid rows, but in walking groups, discussing ideas as they stroll beneath the olive trees. Aristotle wasn't born in Athens. He came from Stagira, a small coastal town in northern Greece, which gave him the nickname the Stagirite. His father was a physician to the royal court of Macedonia, and perhaps this early exposure to both medicine and political power planted the seeds for Aristotle's lifelong fascination with both the natural world and human society. There's something fitting about a philosopher's son learning about life and death, health and illness, before he ever opened a book of pure theory. At 17, Aristotle made his way to Athens and entered Plato's academy, where he would spend the next 20 years. 20 years. Imagine that kind of dedication to learning, to sitting with ideas and letting them develop slowly, naturally, like wine aging in a cellar. He wasn't just a student there, but eventually became a teacher himself, though he would ultimately disagree with many of his master's fundamental ideas. Where Plato looked beyond the physical world to eternal forms and perfect ideals, Aristotle turned his attention to the world right in front of him. He was fascinated by the particular, the individual, the concrete reality of things as they actually exist. If Plato was a dreamer reaching for transcendent truths, Aristotle was the careful observer, notebook in hand, studying the patterns hidden in plain sight. This difference in temperament would shape everything Aristotle wrote. While Plato crafted elegant dialogues that read like philosophical dramas, Aristotle developed systematic treatises that read more like careful field guides to reality itself. His writing style reflects his method: thorough, methodical, always building from careful observation toward general principles. After his time at the academy, Aristotle's life took an unexpected turn. He was invited to tutor the young Alexander, who would later be known as Alexander the Great. Picture this: the future conqueror of the known world, still a teenager, sitting with the philosopher who would teach him about ethics, politics, and the proper way to live. What conversations they must have had! What influence did Aristotle's ideas about human flourishing have on a young man destined to reshape the ancient world? When Alexander set off on his conquests, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. Here, he developed the teaching method that would become his trademark: walking lectures. He and his students would stroll through the covered walkways, the peripatetic method that gave his followers the name peripatetics, literally those who walk around. There's something beautiful about learning while moving, about letting the rhythm of footsteps accompany the rhythm of thought. But what made Aristotle truly revolutionary wasn't just his method of teaching, but his approach to knowledge itself. He was perhaps the first great systematizer, the first thinker to try to organize all human knowledge into connected, coherent disciplines. He didn't just philosophize, he created the very categories we still use to organize learning: logic, ethics, politics, biology, physics, metaphysics, rhetoric, poetics. Think about that for a moment. Before Aristotle, these weren't separate subjects with their own methods and principles. They were all part of the general human attempt to understand the world. Aristotle looked at this vast landscape of curiosity and said, in effect, let's organize this. Let's figure out what tools we need for each kind of investigation. Let's create a map of human knowledge. This systematic approach extended to his method of investigation. Aristotle believed that to understand anything properly, you needed to ask 4 fundamental questions. What came to be known as the 4 causes? When you encounter anything in the world, from a simple wooden table to a complex social institution, you can ask, what is it made of? What form does it take? What brought it into being? And what purpose does it serve? These aren't just abstract philosophical categories. They represent a profoundly practical way of understanding the world around us. When Aristotle looked at an acorn, he didn't just see a small brown object. He saw potential, purpose, a tiny package containing the blueprint for an entire oak tree. The acorn's material cause was its physical substance. Its formal cause was its structure as an acorn. Its efficient cause was the oak tree that produced it. And its final cause was its potential to become an oak tree itself. This way of thinking about causation reveals something essential about Aristotle's worldview. Unlike many philosophers before and after him, he didn't see the world as a collection of random, meaningless objects bumping into each other. He saw it as a cosmos, an ordered whole where everything has its place and purpose, where understanding comes from seeing how the parts fit together into meaningful wholes. This teleological thinking, this focus on purpose and potential, shaped everything Aristotle wrote about the natural world. When he studied animals, he wasn't content just to catalog their features. He wanted to understand how each characteristic served the animal's way of life. Why do fish have gills and not lungs? Because gills serve the purpose of extracting oxygen from water. Why do birds have hollow bones? Because lightness serves the purpose of flight. Modern science has largely moved away from this kind of purpose-driven explanation, preferring mechanical causation to teleological reasoning. But there's something deeply satisfying about Aristotle's approach, something that speaks to our intuitive sense that the natural world makes sense, that it's not just chaos, but cosmos, not just random events, but meaningful patterns. This same systematic, purpose-driven approach guided Aristotle's investigations into human life and society. Just as he believed that every natural thing had a purpose, a function that defined its excellence, he believed that human beings, too, had a characteristic function, a way of living that represented our highest potential. But what is the purpose of human life? What are we as human beings supposed to be doing with our existence? This question would become central to Aristotle's ethics, his systematic investigation into how we ought to live. And his answer, developed over years of careful observation and reflection, would prove to be one of the most influential ideas in the history of human thought. For Aristotle, the answer began with a simple observation about human nature. What makes humans different from plants and animals? What is our distinctive characteristic as a species? Plants grow and reproduce, animals move and sense their environment, but humans do something more. We reason, we deliberate. We make choices based on our understanding of what's good and worthwhile. This capacity for rational choice, for what Aristotle called practical wisdom, pointed toward our function as human beings. Just as the function of an eye is to see clearly, and the function of a heart is to pump blood effectively, the function of a human being is to live rationally, to make good choices, to flourish as the kind of beings we are. But living rationally doesn't mean living like a computer or a calculating machine. Aristotle's conception of human rationality was much richer and more nuanced than that. He understood that we are not just thinking beings, but feeling beings, not just minds, but embodied souls, living in communities with other people. Our rationality must integrate all these aspects of our humanity if it's to guide us toward genuine flourishing. This integration of reason and emotion, individual and community, would become the foundation of Aristotle's approach to ethics. He wasn't interested in abstract moral rules that could be applied mechanically to every situation. Instead, he wanted to understand what it meant for human beings like us, with our particular nature and circumstances, to live well. The Greek word he used for this flourishing life was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but meaning something deeper and richer than momentary pleasure or satisfaction. Eudaimonia is the kind of happiness that comes from living according to your deepest nature, from actualizing your highest potentials, from becoming the kind of person you were meant to be. This flourishing, this eudaimonia, wasn't something you could achieve overnight or through a single grand gesture. For Aristotle, it was the result of a lifetime of good choices, of developing excellent habits, of becoming the kind of person who naturally tends toward what is truly good and worthwhile. He called these excellent habits virtues, and he believed that virtue was not something you were born with, but something you developed through practice, like learning to play a musical instrument or mastering a craft. Think of virtue like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, you wobble and fall, overcorrecting one way then the other. But gradually, through practice and patience, you develop a feel for balance. You don't have to think consciously about every tiny adjustment. The skill becomes part of you, a kind of second nature that allows you to navigate smoothly and gracefully. Aristotle saw moral virtue in much the same way. Take courage, for example. The coward feels too much fear and runs away from every challenge. The reckless person feels too little fear and charges headlong into dangerous situations without proper thought. But the courageous person has learned, through experience and practice, to feel the right amount of fear in the right circumstances and to act appropriately despite that fear. This idea of virtue as a mean between extremes became one of Aristotle's most influential contributions to ethical thinking. He called it the doctrine of the mean, and he applied it to virtually every aspect of human character. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wasteful spending. Pride is the mean between vanity and excessive humility. Friendliness lies between being a pushover and being hostile. But this wasn't a simple mathematical average. Aristotle understood that the mean, the virtuous response, depends entirely on the particular situation and the particular person involved. What counts as appropriate generosity for a wealthy merchant might be excessive for a struggling student. What represents proper courage for an experienced soldier might be reckless bravado for an untrained civilian. This contextual, flexible approach to ethics reflects something profound about Aristotle's understanding of human life. He recognized that we don't live in abstract theoretical worlds, but in concrete particular situations, surrounded by specific people with specific needs and relationships. Ethics isn't about applying universal rules, but about developing the practical wisdom to see clearly what each situation requires, and having the character to act on that understanding. Practical wisdom, or phronesis in Greek, was perhaps the most important virtue in Aristotle's system. It's the ability to deliberate well about human affairs, to see what's truly at stake in a given situation, to understand how different goods and values relate to each other, and to choose the course of action that best serves human flourishing in these particular circumstances. This kind of wisdom can't be learned from books alone, though books might help. It can't be reduced to rules or formulas, though principles might guide us. It develops only through experience, through making choices and living with their consequences, through watching others navigate similar challenges through the slow accumulation of insight that comes from paying careful attention to life as it actually unfolds. Aristotle spent considerable time exploring what this practical wisdom looks like in different spheres of human life. In his Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son Nicomachus, he examines not just individual virtues, but the social contexts in which virtue develops and expresses itself. He understood that we don't become good people in isolation, but through our relationships with others. This social dimension of ethics led Aristotle naturally into political philosophy, which for him was simply ethics writ large. If individual ethics asks how one person can flourish, political philosophy asks how communities can be organized to promote the flourishing of all their members. The two questions are intimately connected because humans are, in Aristotle's famous phrase, political animals. We naturally live in communities, and we can only achieve our full potential as human beings within the context of well-ordered societies. When Aristotle looked around at the various forms of government in the Greek world of his time, he didn't approach them as an abstract theorist, but as a careful observer and classifier. He and his students collected and analyzed the constitutions of over 150 different city-states, trying to understand what made some communities thrive while others struggled or collapsed. From this empirical research, he identified three basic forms of government, each of which could exist in a healthy or corrupted version. Rule by one person could be either kingship, where a virtuous individual governs for the common good, or tyranny, where a selfish ruler exploits others for personal gain. Rule by a few could be either aristocracy, where the best and wisest govern, or oligarchy, where the wealthy rule in their own interests. Rule by many could be either polity, where the citizens govern themselves wisely, or democracy, where mob rule leads to chaos and injustice. Aristotle's analysis reveals his characteristic attention to both ideals and practical realities. He recognized that in theory, kingship might be the best form of government if you could find a person of perfect virtue and wisdom. But he also understood that such individuals are extremely rare, and that even good kings eventually die, leaving the problem of succession. Similarly, aristocracy sounds appealing until you realize how difficult it is to identify who truly deserves to rule and how to prevent aristocrats from becoming a self-serving elite. His own preference leaned toward what he called polity, a form of constitutional government where political power is shared among citizens who have been educated for civic participation. This wasn't democracy in the modern sense, where every adult has an equal vote. Aristotle was skeptical of pure democracy, fearing that it could easily degenerate into mob rule where passionate crowds make decisions without proper deliberation. Instead, he envisioned a community of citizens who possessed both the practical wisdom to make good political decisions and the virtue to put the common good above their private interests. These citizens would need leisure time for political participation, education to develop their judgment, and enough material security to resist corruption. It was an idealistic vision, but one grounded in careful observation of how actual political communities succeeded or failed. This connection between individual virtue and political order reflects one of the deepest themes in Aristotle's thinking. He didn't see ethics and politics as separate domains, but as different aspects of the same fundamental question: how can human beings live together in ways that allow everyone to flourish? Good communities produce good individuals, and good individuals create good communities. It's a virtuous circle, though unfortunately, it can also work in reverse. This holistic approach, this refusal to separate individual from community, mind from body, theory from practice, characterizes everything Aristotle wrote. When he turned his attention to the natural world, he brought the same integrative perspective. His biological works, which represent nearly a quarter of his surviving writings, reveal a mind that was endlessly fascinated by the intricate relationships between form and function in living things. Aristotle was one of the first systematic biologists, and his observations were remarkably accurate. He dissected animals, studied their behavior, and traced their development from birth to maturity. He identified over 500 different species and developed classification systems that influenced biological thinking for over 2,000 years. When he described the development of a chick embryo, noting how different organs appear in sequence during incubation, he was doing pioneering work in what we now call developmental biology. But Aristotle's approach to biology was never merely descriptive. He wanted to understand not just what living things do, but why they do it, how their various parts contribute to their overall way of life. When he observed that dolphins are mammals rather than fish, despite living in water, he wasn't just making a taxonomic distinction. He was recognizing that form follows function, that the dolphin's warm-bloodedness and lung breathing serve its particular ecological niche. This teleological approach, this focus on purpose and function, extended to his understanding of the soul. For Aristotle, the soul wasn't a separate entity, temporarily imprisoned in a physical body, as Plato had suggested. Instead, it was the form of a living body, the organizing principle that makes a collection of physical materials into a unified, functioning organism. Just as we can distinguish between a living tree and a dead piece of wood, even though they might contain the same chemical elements. Aristotle distinguished between bodies that have souls and those that don't. The soul is what makes the difference, what transforms mere matter into life. It's not a thing, but a process, not a substance, but an activity, the activity of living itself. This naturalistic understanding of the soul had profound implications for how Aristotle thought about human nature. We are not angels trapped in physical prisons, but embodied beings whose thinking and feeling are intimately connected to our biological nature. Our rationality doesn't separate us from nature, but represents nature's highest achievement, at least on Earth. This biological understanding of human nature shaped Aristotle's approach to psychology, though he wouldn't have used that modern term. For him, the study of the soul, what he called psychology, from the Greek words for soul and study, was simply the investigation of what makes living things alive and conscious. He identified 3 levels of soul, each building upon the previous one like floors in a house. The nutritive soul, shared by all living things, including plants, governs growth, nutrition, and reproduction. The sensitive soul, found in animals, adds perception, emotion, and movement. The rational soul, unique to humans, includes the capacity for abstract thought, moral reasoning, and contemplation of eternal truths. But these weren't separate compartments sealed off from each other. Aristotle understood that in actual living beings, these different aspects of soul work together as an integrated whole. When you feel hungry, your nutritive soul signals a bodily need. Your sensitive soul experiences the discomfort of hunger, and your rational soul deliberates about what and when to eat. The fully human response integrates all 3 levels. This integration becomes particularly important when we consider Aristotle's understanding of knowledge and learning. Unlike philosophers who treated the mind as separate from the senses, Aristotle insisted that all human knowledge begins with sensory experience. We don't come into the world with innate ideas or perfect recollections from a previous existence. Instead, we arrive with the capacity to learn, and we learn by encountering the world through our senses. Picture a newborn child gradually making sense of the blooming, buzzing confusion of sensory experience. At first, there are just patches of light and color, sounds and textures without meaning. But slowly, patterns emerge. The child learns to recognize faces, to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar voices, to coordinate sight and touch. From countless particular experiences, the mind gradually abstracts general concepts. This is mother, this is warmth, this is comfort. Aristotle called this process of moving from particular sensations to general concepts induction, and he saw it as the foundation of all human knowledge. We don't start with universal principles and deduce particular facts. Instead, we start with particular observations and gradually work our way up to general understanding. But once we have grasped these general principles through inductive reasoning, we can then use deductive logic to explore their implications. This is where Aristotle made another revolutionary contribution to human thought. He essentially invented formal logic, creating the systematic study of valid reasoning that would dominate Western thinking for over 2,000 years. His syllogistic logic might seem dry and technical at first glance, but it represents something profound about the human capacity for reasoning. When we say all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, we're not just playing word games. We're demonstrating the mind's ability to move from general principles to particular conclusions with perfect certainty, to extend our knowledge beyond what we can directly observe. This logical framework gave Aristotle confidence that human beings could achieve genuine knowledge, not just opinion or belief, about the natural world and human affairs. Unlike skeptics, who doubted whether we could know anything with certainty, or like Plato, who located true knowledge in a transcendent realm beyond ordinary experience, Aristotle believed that careful observation combined with rigorous reasoning could reveal the actual structure of reality. This confidence in human rationality extended to his understanding of scientific inquiry. Aristotle believed that the natural world was intelligible, that it operated according to discoverable principles that the human mind could grasp. When he observed that heavy objects fall toward the center of the earth while flames rise upward, he didn't just record these facts. He developed a theory about natural places and natural motions that could explain a wide range of physical phenomena. His physics, while ultimately superseded by modern science, represented a serious attempt to make sense of motion, change, and causation in the natural world. He distinguished between natural motions, like stones falling or flames rising, which require no external explanation, and violent motions, like throwing a ball, which require some external force to explain them. The same systematic approach guided his investigations into meteorology, astronomy, and what we might now call geology. He theorized about the formation of mountains, the causes of earthquakes, the nature of comets, and the structure of the heavens. Some of his conclusions were wrong by modern standards, but his method of careful observation, followed by theoretical explanation, established patterns of scientific thinking that remain influential today. Perhaps nowhere is Aristotle's systematic genius more evident than in his approach to human communication and persuasion. His Rhetoric, one of his most practical and enduring works, represents the first comprehensive analysis of how language works to influence human behavior and decision-making. Aristotle recognized that in human affairs, we rarely deal with the kind of logical certainty that mathematical proofs provide. Instead, we operate in the realm of probability and likelihood, making decisions based on incomplete information under conditions of uncertainty. In such situations, the ability to communicate effectively, to present arguments persuasively, to move people toward good choices, becomes crucial. He identified 3 fundamental modes of persuasion that remain central to effective communication today. Ethos refers to the character and credibility of the speaker. People are more likely to be persuaded by someone they trust, someone who demonstrates wisdom, virtue, and goodwill toward the audience. This isn't manipulation, but recognition of the obvious truth that we pay more attention to people we respect. Pathos involves the emotional dimension of persuasion, the speaker's ability to evoke appropriate feelings in the audience. Aristotle understood that humans are not purely rational calculating machines. We are emotional beings, and our feelings properly influence our judgments. The key is to evoke emotions that are appropriate to the situation, and that support rather than distort good judgment. Logos refers to the logical structure of the argument itself, the evidence and reasoning that support the speaker's position. Even when dealing with probabilities rather than certainties, even when emotions are involved, there are still better and worse ways to reason about human affairs. Effective rhetoric, in Aristotle's understanding, integrates all 3 elements. The speaker must be trustworthy, must connect emotionally with the audience, and must present solid reasoning. This isn't cynical manipulation, but skillful communication in service of truth and justice. After all, Aristotle pointed out, if good people don't learn to communicate persuasively, they'll be defeated by those who use rhetoric for selfish or harmful purposes. This practical wisdom about communication reflects a broader theme in Aristotle's thinking: the recognition that human life involves not just contemplation, but action, not just understanding, but effective engagement with the world. Unlike some philosophers who saw involvement in practical affairs as a distraction from pure thought, Aristotle celebrated the active life as one of the highest forms of human flourishing. He distinguished between different types of human activity, each valuable in its own way. Theoria, or contemplation, involves the mind's direct engagement with eternal truths, the kind of thinking we do in mathematics or philosophy when we're not trying to accomplish anything practical, but simply trying to understand. This was for Aristotle the highest form of human activity, the closest we can come to the divine activity of pure thought. But he also celebrated praxis, or ethical and political action, the activity by which we shape our characters and our communities according to our understanding of what is good and just. This isn't just applying theoretical knowledge, but exercising practical wisdom in the concrete circumstances of human life. And he recognized the value of poiesis, or productive activity, the making of useful or beautiful objects that didn't exist before. This includes everything from crafting furniture to composing poetry, from building houses to creating works of art. Each type of activity has its own excellence, its own standards of success, its own contribution to human flourishing. The mistake is to try to reduce all human activity to just one type, to think that only contemplation matters, or only practical results count, or only productive output has value. This appreciation for the full range of human activity led Aristotle to write what many consider his most brilliant and influential work on the arts, the Poetics. Though only the section on tragedy survives complete, it represents the first systematic analysis of how literary art works and why it matters in human life. Aristotle's approach to poetry and drama was characteristically practical and systematic. He wasn't interested in abstract theories about beauty, but in understanding how actual poems and plays achieve their effects on actual audiences. What makes a tragedy tragic? What distinguishes good poetry from bad? Why do people find pleasure in artistic representations of painful or frightening events? His famous definition of tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude might sound technical, but it captures something essential about how narrative art works. Tragedy doesn't just present random events, but shapes them into meaningful patterns that reveal something important about human life. The tragic plot, according to Aristotle, should be unified and complete, with every element contributing to the overall effect. It should evoke both pity and fear in the audience. Pity for the tragic hero's suffering, and fear that similar misfortune could befall anyone. And it should produce catharsis, a purging or purification of these emotions that leaves the audience somehow cleansed and enlightened. This analysis of catharsis remains one of the most influential, but also most debated ideas in literary theory. What exactly did Aristotle mean? How does witnessing fictional suffering purify our emotions? Different interpreters have offered different answers, but the basic insight seems profound: that art can take painful aspects of human experience and transform them into something that enlarges rather than diminishes our humanity. The tragic hero, in Aristotle's analysis, should be someone neither perfectly virtuous nor completely evil, but somewhere in between. Someone whose downfall results not from moral depravity, but from some error in judgment, what he called hamartia. This makes the tragedy both believable and emotionally powerful. We can identify with the hero because they're fundamentally like us, capable of both good and evil. And their fall teaches us something about the human condition without simply punishing wickedness or rewarding virtue. This understanding of tragedy reflects Aristotle's broader insight into human nature. We are neither angels nor demons, but complex beings capable of both wisdom and folly, virtue and vice. Our mistakes often result not from malicious intent, but from limitations in our understanding, from the difficulty of seeing clearly in complex situations, from the challenge of living well in an uncertain world. This compassionate understanding of human frailty and complexity permeates all of Aristotle's thinking about art and life. He didn't approach human experience with the cold detachment of a scientist studying specimens under a microscope. Instead, he brought the warm curiosity of someone who genuinely cared about how we might live better, think more clearly, and create more beautiful things. Consider how this perspective influenced his understanding of friendship, which he considered one of the most important aspects of human flourishing. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he devoted more space to friendship than to any other single topic, recognizing that our relationships with others form the fabric within which all other virtues develop and express themselves. Aristotle distinguished between 3 different types of friendship, each valuable but serving different purposes in human life. Friendships of utility are based on mutual benefit. We become friends with people who can help us in some way, and we help them in return. These relationships are perfectly legitimate and necessary for social life, but they tend to be temporary and somewhat superficial. When the usefulness ends, the friendship often fades. Friendships of pleasure are based on the enjoyment we take in each other's company. We become friends with people who share our interests, who make us laugh, who are fun to be around. These relationships can be deeper than merely useful ones, but they too tend to change as our tastes and circumstances evolve. The friend who shares your passion for mountain climbing might drift away when you develop different interests, but the highest form of friendship, what Aristotle called complete friendship or virtue friendship, is based on mutual admiration for each other's character. These are friendships between people who recognize and appreciate the virtue in each other, who genuinely want what's best for the friend, not for their own sake, but for the friend's sake. Such friendships are rare, Aristotle acknowledged, because they require time to develop, and because genuinely virtuous people are not common. Yet these deep friendships represent something crucial about human nature. We are not solitary beings who happen to live near each other. We are fundamentally social creatures who discover and develop our best selves through loving relationships with others. The friend who knows us well and still cares for us, who challenges us to be better while accepting us as we are, provides a kind of mirror in which we can see ourselves more clearly. This insight about the social nature of human flourishing extended to Aristotle's thinking about the relationship between individual and community. He famously observed that anyone who could live completely apart from society would have to be either a beast or a god. For ordinary humans, the attempt to achieve self-sufficiency in isolation is both impossible and ultimately self-defeating. We need others not just for material survival, but for moral and intellectual development. The child learns virtue by imitating virtuous adults. The student learns wisdom through dialogue with teachers and fellow learners. The citizen develops practical wisdom by participating in the deliberations of the community. Even the philosopher, engaged in the most solitary of activities, builds upon the insights of previous thinkers and contributes to an ongoing conversation that spans generations. This understanding of human interdependence shaped Aristotle's approach to education, though his ideas about learning were quite different from modern classroom instruction. He believed that true education was not primarily about transmitting information, but about developing capacities, not about filling empty vessels, but about nurturing the natural human potential for growth and understanding. The process begins in infancy with habituation, the gradual formation of good habits through practice and repetition. Just as we learn to walk by walking, to speak by speaking, we learn to be virtuous by acting virtuously, even before we fully understand what virtue means. The child who is consistently encouraged to share toys, to tell the truth, to be kind to others is developing patterns of behavior that will eventually become second nature. But habituation alone is not enough for full human development. As we mature, we need to understand not just what we should do, but why we should do it. This is where rational instruction becomes important, not as mere rule following, but as the development of practical wisdom that can guide us in new and complex situations. The highest level of education, for those capable of it, involves theoretical understanding, the contemplation of eternal truths that exist independently of human purposes and desires. This might seem abstract or impractical, but Aristotle believed that such contemplation represents the pinnacle of human activity, the moment when the human mind touches something divine. When we understand a mathematical proof, when we grasp the logical structure of a philosophical argument, when we see how the parts of a living organism work together to serve the whole, we are participating in the kind of pure thinking that Aristotle believed characterized divine activity. For a moment, we transcend the limitations of our particular circumstances and connect with truths that are universal and eternal. Yet this contemplative activity doesn't separate us from practical life, but enriches it. The person who has developed both practical wisdom and theoretical understanding brings a deeper perspective to everyday choices and challenges. They can see beyond immediate pressures and concerns to the larger patterns and principles that should guide human action. This integration of contemplation and action, theory and practice, represents one of Aristotle's most distinctive contributions to human self-understanding. Unlike traditions that see these as competing alternatives, where you must choose either the active life or the contemplative life, Aristotle envisioned human flourishing as involving both, each enriching and supporting the other. The statesman who has studied ethics and political theory brings philosophical insight to practical governance. The craftsperson who understands the theoretical principles underlying their art can innovate and adapt in ways that mere technical training wouldn't allow. The friend who has reflected deeply on the nature of friendship can love more wisely and generously. This holistic approach to human development reflects Aristotle's fundamental conviction that reality itself is an integrated whole, not a collection of separate, unrelated parts. When he looked at the natural world, he saw not just individual objects, but a cosmic order in which each thing has its proper place and function. The elements earth, water, air, and fire each have their natural places and natural motions. Living beings form a great chain from the simplest plants to the most complex animals, each level building upon and transcending the previous one. Human beings occupy a unique position in this cosmic hierarchy. We share the nutritive functions of plants and the sensitive functions of animals, but we alone possess the capacity for rational thought. This gives us both great privilege and great responsibility. We are the beings through whom nature becomes conscious of itself, through whom the cosmic order can be understood and appreciated. But with this capacity comes the burden of choice. Unlike plants, which simply grow according to their nature, or animals which follow their instincts, humans must decide how to live. We can choose to develop our rational capacities or neglect them. We can choose to live virtuously or viciously. We can choose to fulfill our nature as rational, social beings or fall short of our potential. This freedom to choose our own character and destiny is what makes ethics possible and necessary. If we were determined by our nature like plants or animals, there would be no point in discussing how we ought to live. If we were pure minds like gods, we would automatically choose what is best. But as beings caught between necessity and freedom, between the animal and the divine, we face the ongoing challenge of creating ourselves through our choices. Aristotle's ethics is ultimately an ethics of self-creation, of taking responsibility for becoming the kind of person we want to be. But it's not a naive individualism that ignores our social nature and our dependence on others. Instead, it recognizes that we create ourselves within communities, in relationship with others, through participation in shared activities and common purposes. The good life, the flourishing life, emerges from this creative tension between individual development and social participation, between personal excellence and contribution to the common good. We become ourselves most fully when we give ourselves most generously to purposes larger than ourselves. This insight resonates through all of Aristotle's work, from his analysis of friendship to his vision of the ideal state, from his understanding of artistic creation to his account of philosophical contemplation. Human excellence is always excellence in relationship, virtue always virtue in community, wisdom always wisdom shared and applied. As we listen to these ideas across the centuries, we might recognize in them something that speaks to our own deepest intuitions about what it means to live well. In our age of rapid change and social fragmentation, Aristotle's emphasis on character development, meaningful relationships, and civic participation offers a kind of anchor, a reminder of enduring truths about human nature and human flourishing. His voice reaches us not as commandments from on high, but as gentle observations from a fellow traveler on the human journey, someone who looked carefully at how people actually live and thought deeply about how they might live better. The walking teacher, pacing the covered pathways of the Lyceum with his students, continues his patient exploration of what it means to be human. In the rustling of leaves and the rhythm of footsteps, in the quiet moments of reflection between one idea and the next, we can still hear the echo of those ancient conversations about virtue and friendship, about art and politics, about the endless fascinating complexity of human existence. The questions Aristotle asked are still our questions. The challenges he identified are still our challenges. The hope he offered, that careful thought and virtuous action can lead to genuine flourishing, remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about this systematic thinker from so long ago. He didn't just create abstract theories or logical systems, though he did both of those things brilliantly. He created a way of thinking about human life that honors both our limitations and our possibilities, both our need for community and our capacity for individual excellence, both our rootedness in the natural world and our ability to transcend it through reason and choice. The gentle philosopher who believed that wonder is the beginning of wisdom continues to inspire wonder in those who encounter his ideas. In the quiet spaces of reflection, in the moments when we pause to consider what really matters, his voice still whispers across the centuries, inviting us to think more clearly, choose more wisely, and live more fully as the remarkable beings we are. The questions that occupied Aristotle's mind in those long walks through the Lyceum weren't abstract puzzles divorced from daily experience. They emerged from his deep curiosity about the world around him, from watching how people actually lived, how societies actually functioned, how art actually moved its audiences. He was a philosopher who kept his feet firmly planted on the ground even as his mind soared to the highest theoretical heights. This grounded approach becomes especially clear when we examine his understanding of human emotions. Unlike philosophers who saw emotions as obstacles to clear thinking or as mere disturbances of the soul to be overcome, Aristotle recognized that emotions play a crucial role in human flourishing. They're not just random feelings that happen to us, but intelligent responses to our circumstances that can guide us toward appropriate action. Consider anger, an emotion that many philosophical traditions have viewed with suspicion. Aristotle didn't see anger as simply good or bad in itself. Instead, he asked more nuanced questions. When is anger appropriate? How much anger is fitting in different situations? At whom should we be angry, and for how long? The person who never gets angry even when witnessing injustice lacks something important, just as much as the person who flies into rage at every minor inconvenience. The key, once again, is finding the appropriate response that takes into account all the relevant circumstances. The parent who feels no anger when their child is bullied is failing to respond appropriately to the situation. But the parent who becomes so enraged that they can't think clearly or act wisely is also missing the mark. Righteous anger, properly felt and properly expressed, can motivate us to correct injustices and protect what we value. This nuanced understanding of emotions extended to Aristotle's analysis of pleasure, another aspect of human experience that philosophers often approached with suspicion. He didn't advocate for hedonistic pursuit of pleasure, nor did he recommend ascetic rejection of all enjoyable experiences. Instead, he tried to understand what pleasure really is and how it fits into a flourishing human life. Pleasure, Aristotle observed, accompanies activities when they're performed well. The musician experiences pleasure when playing beautifully, the craftsperson when creating something excellent, the friend when spending time with someone they care about. Pleasure isn't something separate from these activities, something added on from the outside. It's the natural accompaniment of doing what we're good at, of exercising our capacities excellently. This suggests that the way to experience genuine pleasure isn't to pursue it directly, but to develop our abilities and engage in worthwhile activities. The person who tries to maximize pleasure without regard to the value of the activities that produce it often ends up feeling empty and restless. But the person who focuses on excellence in worthwhile pursuits finds that pleasure follows naturally. Think about the difference between the shallow pleasure of scrolling through social media and the deep satisfaction of mastering a skill or deepening a relationship. Both might be called pleasurable, but they affect us differently. One leaves us wanting more but somehow unsatisfied, while the other enriches our sense of who we are and what we're capable of becoming. Aristotle's insight here points toward a profound truth about human motivation. We're not just pleasure-seeking machines trying to maximize good feelings and minimize bad ones. We're meaning-seeking beings who find our deepest satisfaction in activities that express our nature and contribute to purposes larger than ourselves. This understanding of human motivation shaped his approach to education and character development. He recognized that you can't simply tell people what virtues they should develop and expect them to change overnight. Character formation is a gradual process that requires the right kinds of experiences, the right kinds of models, and the right kinds of practice. Consider how someone learns to be generous. It's not enough to understand intellectually that generosity is a virtue. The potential generous person needs opportunities to practice giving, examples of generous people to observe and emulate, and a community that recognizes and celebrates generous actions. They need to experience both the pleasure that comes from helping others and the social bonds that form when people share resources and support each other. But they also need to learn the practical wisdom that guides generous action. When should you give, and when is it better to withhold? How much should you give without harming your own ability to care for legitimate responsibilities? How can you give in ways that truly help, rather than creating dependence or resentment? These aren't questions that can be answered once and for all, but require ongoing reflection and adjustment as circumstances change. This attention to the practical details of virtue development reveals something important about Aristotle's philosophical method. He wasn't content with elegant theories that sounded good in abstract discussions. He wanted to understand how ideas actually worked in the messy complexity of real human lives. When he analyzed the concept of justice, for instance, he didn't just offer a single definition and consider the matter settled. Instead, he distinguished between different types of justice, each with its own logic and application. Distributive justice concerns how goods and honors should be allocated among members of a community. Should everyone receive equal shares, or should distribution be based on merit, need, or some other criterion? Corrective justice deals with how to respond when someone has been wronged. How do we restore balance after theft, fraud, or injury? What kinds of punishment fit different types of crimes? How can we distinguish between accidents and intentional harms? These aren't just theoretical questions, but practical challenges that every society must address. Aristotle's analysis doesn't provide simple formulas that can be mechanically applied to every case. Instead, it offers conceptual tools for thinking more clearly about the different considerations that should guide our decisions about fairness and punishment. His approach to justice reflects his broader conviction that philosophical thinking should serve life, not the other way around. We don't live in order to have interesting things to think about. We think in order to live better. Philosophy's value lies not in its abstract beauty, but in its capacity to illuminate the choices we face and guide us toward wiser decisions. This practical orientation becomes especially evident in Aristotle's treatment of akrasia, a Greek word often translated as weakness of will or incontinence. This is the puzzling phenomenon where people seem to know what they should do but fail to do it anyway. The person who knows that smoking is harmful but continues smoking. The student who knows they should study but keeps procrastinating. The friend who knows they should call someone going through a difficult time but somehow never gets around to it. Plato had suggested that such behavior was impossible, arguing that if people truly knew what was good for them, they would always act accordingly. Apparent weakness of will must therefore reflect ignorance, not genuine moral failure. But Aristotle, with his characteristic attention to how people actually behave, recognized that the phenomenon was real and required explanation. His analysis distinguished between different types of knowledge. There's universal knowledge, like knowing that excessive drinking is harmful to health. And there's particular knowledge, like recognizing that this specific drink, in these specific circumstances, would be excessive for me right now. Weakness of will often occurs when we possess the universal knowledge, but fail to apply it to our particular situation. Think about someone on a diet who knows perfectly well that eating too much sugar is unhealthy. In the abstract, they're completely committed to eating better. But when faced with a delicious dessert at a friend's birthday party, they might find themselves saying, "Just this once won't hurt." They haven't forgotten their general knowledge about nutrition, but they've failed to connect that knowledge to this specific moment of choice. Aristotle's analysis suggests that overcoming weakness of will isn't primarily a matter of acquiring more information or making stronger resolutions. Instead, it requires developing the practical wisdom to see clearly how general principles apply to specific situations and the strength of character to act on that understanding even when it's difficult. This insight has profound implications for how we think about moral education and personal growth. It's not enough to teach people abstract principles or inspire them with noble ideals. We need to help them develop the practical skills of moral perception and the habitual strength to act on what they see. But this might involve practicing moral decision-making in low-stakes situations so that we're better prepared for high-stakes moments. It might mean surrounding ourselves with people who model the kind of behavior we aspire to. It might require changing our environment to make good choices easier and bad choices harder. The person trying to eat more healthily might need to stock their kitchen with nutritious foods and avoid keeping tempting junk food around. The student trying to study more consistently might need to find a quiet place to work and turn off distracting devices. The friend trying to be more supportive might need to set reminders to check in with people they care about. These practical strategies reflect Aristotle's understanding that we are embodied beings living in social and physical environments that shape our behavior in countless subtle ways. Virtue isn't just a matter of having the right thoughts or feelings, but of creating conditions that support virtuous action. This holistic approach to human development extended to Aristotle's understanding of the relationship between individual flourishing and social justice. He didn't see these as competing concerns where we must choose between personal happiness and moral obligation. Instead, he argued that genuine personal flourishing is only possible within just communities, and that just communities depend on citizens who have developed excellent character. The person who tries to achieve happiness through purely selfish means will find that such happiness is shallow and unstable. Our deepest satisfactions come from meaningful relationships, worthwhile work, and contribution to causes larger than ourselves. But these goods are only available in communities where people treat each other with justice and respect. Conversely, communities can only remain just if their citizens possess the virtues necessary for civic participation. A society of purely self-interested individuals will inevitably degenerate into conflict and oppression. Justice requires citizens who can sometimes put the common good ahead of immediate personal advantage, who can engage in reasonable discussion about shared problems, who can be trusted to keep their commitments even when it's costly. This creates what we might call a virtuous circle, where individual virtue and social justice reinforce each other. Good people create good institutions, and good institutions help produce good people. But unfortunately, the circle can also work in reverse. Corrupt institutions tend to corrupt the people who participate in them, and corrupted people create increasingly dysfunctional institutions. This analysis helps explain why Aristotle paid so much attention to the design of political systems and educational institutions. He understood that individual character development doesn't happen in a vacuum. but is profoundly shaped by social structures and cultural practices. If we want people to develop virtue, we need to create social conditions that encourage and reward virtuous behavior. At the same time, he recognized that institutional reform alone isn't sufficient. Even the best designed institutions will fail if the people who operate them lack the character necessary to make them work. There's no substitute for the slow, patient work of character development that must happen one person at a time, through the countless daily choices that gradually shape who we become. This tension between individual and social reform remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. We continue to debate how much we should focus on changing individuals versus changing systems, how much personal responsibility matters versus social conditions. Aristotle's insight suggests that this is a false choice. Both individual virtue and just institutions are necessary, and they must develop together. His approach to these enduring questions wasn't to offer simple answers, but to provide conceptual frameworks for thinking more clearly about complex issues. He gave us tools for analysis rather than predetermined conclusions, ways of asking better questions rather than final solutions. This methodological contribution may be as important as any specific doctrine he taught. In an age of rapid change and increasing complexity, we need the kind of flexible, nuanced thinking that Aristotle modeled. We need the ability to distinguish between different types of questions and apply appropriate methods to each. We need the patience to observe carefully before theorizing, and the wisdom to recognize when our theories need revision in light of new evidence. Most importantly, we need the integration of intellectual rigor with practical wisdom, the ability to think clearly about abstract principles while remaining attentive to the concrete particularities of actual situations. This is the kind of thinking that can navigate between rigid dogmatism and shapeless relativism, between naive idealism and cynical realism. In our current moment, when public discourse often seems dominated by extreme positions and simplistic solutions, Aristotle's example offers a different model. He showed us how to hold complexity without being paralyzed by it, how to maintain intellectual humility without abandoning the search for truth, how to remain committed to high ideals while staying grounded in practical reality. The philosopher who walked the pathways of the Lyceum, thinking aloud with his students about the deepest questions of human existence, continues to walk with us today. His voice joins the ongoing conversation about how we might live together more wisely, more justly, more fully. In the quiet moments when we pause to reflect on what really matters, we can still hear the gentle invitation to wonder, to question, to seek understanding not as an end in itself, but as a guide to living well. The systematic thinker who organized all human knowledge into interconnected disciplines reminds us that the various aspects of our lives, our individual development and our social relationships, our practical choices and our theoretical understanding, are not separate compartments, but parts of a larger whole. The flourishing life integrates all these dimensions, finding in each a reflection of the others. As the evening deepens and thoughts begin to settle into the quieter rhythms of reflection, Aristotle's presence remains with us like a trusted companion, neither demanding our agreement nor requiring our perfect understanding, but simply offering the fruits of a lifetime spent in careful attention to the mystery and possibility of human existence. In that gentle presence, we find not answers to all our questions, but the courage to keep questioning, the wisdom to keep wondering, the hope that understanding and virtue remain within our reach if we're patient enough to pursue them. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Aristotle's legacy is how his ideas about learning and knowledge continue to resonate with our deepest intuitions about human growth. He understood that genuine learning isn't simply the accumulation of facts or the memorization of principles, but a transformation of the learner's capacity to perceive and respond to the world. When we truly learn something, we don't just add information to our mental filing cabinet. We become different kinds of people, capable of seeing patterns we couldn't see before, of making connections that were previously invisible. This transformative understanding of learning shaped Aristotle's approach to teaching. He didn't see himself as pouring knowledge into empty vessels, but as helping students discover capacities they already possessed but hadn't yet developed. The famous Socratic method of questioning, which Aristotle inherited from his philosophical lineage, operates on this principle. The teacher doesn't simply tell students the right answers, but guides them through a process of inquiry that allows them to discover insights for themselves. Think about the difference between being told that something is true and coming to see why it's true through your own reflection and investigation. The knowledge gained through personal discovery has a different quality. It becomes part of you in a way that borrowed knowledge never quite does. It changes not just what you know, but how you think, not just your beliefs, but your basic orientation toward the world. This insight about the nature of learning helps explain why Aristotle's educational philosophy emphasized experience and practice alongside theoretical instruction. You can't learn to be virtuous just by studying ethical theory, any more than you can learn to play the piano just by reading about music. Virtue, like musical skill, requires repeated practice, gradual development of sensitivity and judgment, patient cultivation of new habits and capacities. But Aristotle also understood that practice without reflection can become mere routine, while reflection without practice remains abstract and ineffective. The integration of theory and practice, of understanding and action, creates a kind of learning that transforms both mind and character. The student who studies ethical principles and also practices virtuous behavior develops a different kind of moral knowledge than someone who engages in only one of these activities. This integrated approach to learning extended to Aristotle's understanding of how communities transmit their values and wisdom across generations. He recognized that culture is not just a collection of ideas and customs, but a living process of education that shapes each new generation's capacity to think and act well. The stories we tell, the heroes we celebrate, the practices we maintain, the institutions we create, all serve as teachers that form young minds and hearts. A community that tells stories celebrating courage, honesty, and generosity will tend to produce citizens who value these qualities. A society that creates institutions requiring civic participation will develop citizens capable of such participation. But a culture that celebrates only individual success, that tells stories glorifying selfishness or cruelty, will shape its members in very different directions. This understanding of cultural education places enormous responsibility on each generation to consider what kind of legacy it's creating for the next. We are all teachers, whether we realize it or not, through the examples we set, the institutions we support, the stories we choose to tell and retell. The question becomes not whether we will influence those who come after us, but how we will influence them. Aristotle's own influence on subsequent generations provides a fascinating case study in how ideas travel across time and cultures. His works were preserved and transmitted through a remarkable chain of scholarly communities, from ancient Athens to medieval Baghdad to the universities of medieval Europe. Each generation of readers discovered in his writings resources for addressing their own questions and challenges. Medieval Islamic philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna found in Aristotle's rational approach to understanding the natural world a framework that could complement their religious commitments. Medieval Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas integrated Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating new syntheses that influenced Western thought for centuries. Renaissance humanists rediscovered Aristotelian insights about rhetoric and poetics, using them to develop new approaches to education and artistic creation. But this transmission wasn't simply passive preservation. Each generation of readers actively interpreted and adapted Aristotelian ideas, finding in them resources for their own creative work, while also recognizing limitations that needed to be transcended. Modern science largely rejected Aristotelian physics while maintaining his commitment to systematic observation and rational explanation. Contemporary virtue ethicists have revived interest in Aristotelian moral philosophy while adapting it to address modern concerns about gender, cultural diversity, and social justice. This dynamic relationship between tradition and innovation reflects something important about how human knowledge develops. We don't simply reject the past as outdated or accept it as infallible authority. Instead, we engage in ongoing dialogue with previous thinkers, learning from their insights while also moving beyond their limitations. Each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before, while also reaching toward new possibilities that earlier thinkers couldn't envision. This process of creative transmission helps explain why Aristotle's influence has been so enduring and so varied. His systematic approach to inquiry, his attention to both theory and practice, his integration of individual and social concerns, his commitment to careful observation combined with rigorous reasoning, all provide resources that can be adapted to address new questions and challenges. Consider how his understanding of human flourishing might speak to contemporary concerns about mental health and well-being. Modern psychology has rediscovered many Aristotelian insights about the importance of meaningful relationships, purposeful activity, and character development for psychological health. The growing field of positive psychology, with its focus on human strengths and optimal functioning rather than just mental illness, echoes themes that Aristotle explored over 2 millennia ago. His analysis of friendship has found new relevance in an age when many people struggle with loneliness and social isolation. His insights about the different types of friendship, the importance of mutual care and understanding, the role of shared activities in building deep relationships, all speak to contemporary questions about how to create meaningful connections in increasingly fragmented societies. Similarly, his approach to moral education offers resources for thinking about how to develop ethical sensitivity and judgment in complex modern contexts. His emphasis on practical wisdom, on learning to see clearly what particular situations require, provides an alternative to both rigid rule-following and relativistic subjectivism. His understanding of virtue as habit developed through practice suggests concrete approaches to character development that don't rely solely on rational persuasion or emotional inspiration. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotle's example of patient, systematic inquiry into fundamental questions about human life provides a model for how we might approach the challenges of our own time. He showed how it's possible to be both rigorous and humble, both committed to truth and open to revision, both grounded in careful observation and reaching toward comprehensive understanding. In an era when public discourse often seems dominated by quick judgments and superficial analysis, when complex problems are reduced to simple talking points, when ideological commitments override careful investigation, Aristotle's methodical approach offers a different path. He reminds us that the most important questions require sustained attention, that genuine understanding develops slowly through patient inquiry, that wisdom involves not just knowing the right answers, but learning to ask better questions. His integration of theoretical and practical concerns also speaks to contemporary debates about the purpose of education and intellectual inquiry. Should universities focus on practical skills that prepare students for careers, or should they pursue knowledge for its own sake? Should scholarship address immediate social problems, or should it explore fundamental questions that may not have obvious practical applications? Aristotle's example suggests that this is another false choice. The deepest theoretical insights often have profound practical implications, while the most pressing practical problems often require theoretical understanding for their solution. The scholar who studies ancient philosophy might discover insights about human nature that illuminate contemporary ethical dilemmas. The researcher investigating abstract mathematical principles might develop tools that revolutionize technology and medicine. The key is maintaining the integration that Aristotle modeled, pursuing theoretical understanding while remaining attentive to practical applications, addressing immediate concerns while also exploring fundamental questions. This requires the kind of intellectual courage that can hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it, that can pursue long-term investigations while also responding to urgent needs. As we consider Aristotle's continuing relevance, we might also reflect on the limitations and blind spots in his thinking that subsequent generations have had to address. His acceptance of slavery and his restrictive views about women's capacities remind us that even the greatest thinkers are shaped by the assumptions of their time and culture. His confidence in the hierarchical ordering of nature has been challenged by evolutionary biology and ecological thinking. His focus on individual character development needs to be balanced with greater attention to systemic injustices and structural inequalities. But rather than simply dismissing his contributions because of these limitations, we can learn from both his insights and his errors. His mistakes remind us to approach all human thinking, including our own, with appropriate humility. His achievements show us what becomes possible when brilliant minds are devoted to careful, sustained inquiry into fundamental questions. The process of learning from past thinkers while also moving beyond their limitations is itself an Aristotelian activity. It requires the kind of practical wisdom that can distinguish between what remains valuable and what needs to be revised, between insights that transcend particular historical contexts and conclusions that reflect the biases of specific times and places. This discriminating engagement with tradition is particularly important as we face challenges that Aristotle couldn't have anticipated. Climate change, global inequality, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nuclear weapons, all raise questions that require both ancient wisdom about human nature and contemporary understanding of complex systems. We need both Aristotelian insights about virtue and character and modern knowledge about social psychology and institutional design. And so we find ourselves at the end of another gentle exploration, having walked alongside the great systematizer through the pathways of ancient wisdom. Aristotle's voice fades into the quiet evening, but his questions remain with us like old friends, patient and persistent, inviting us to wonder about our own lives, our own choices, our own possibilities for flourishing Whether you're drifting towards sleep or simply pausing in reflection, know that the search for wisdom continues, one thoughtful step at a time, in the company of all those who've ever wondered what it truly means to live well.